the history of the intertestamental period, and then we'll move on to some other topics within that range. But we're going to be talking about the period from 63 BC when Pompey entered Jerusalem and kind of started setting the tone for Roman domination. And we're going to take this all the way up to 4 BC when Herod the Great dies. Herod the Great is the Herod of that was a king when Jesus was born. The Herod that got paranoid when the Magi came and asked about the king, and he decides to execute all the babies in Bethlehem. But because of the angel, Joseph and Mary and Jesus escape to Egypt, where they lived probably among the Jewish community in Alexandria or something similar. We've talked about how the Jewish community in Alexandria came to be there in Egypt. And they basically wait until Herod dies, and that's when they return to Palestine and settle in Nazareth. Excuse me. As a side note, I've never been entirely sure because I don't think the New Testament spells it out. I could be wrong, but memory serves correctly. The New Testament doesn't actually spell out where Mary and Joseph were living before they got to Bethlehem and Jesus was born. It's not clear whether they went back to Nazareth because that's where they were living before they had to go to Bethlehem for the census, or if they were living somewhere else. It does seem clear that they're not living in Bethlehem when the census is taken and they have to travel there. But I'm not sure that they were from Nazareth. I don't know that it's stated clearly that they were from Nazareth. Joseph, though, may have grown up in Bethlehem. It's kind of how you reckon things. But that's another subject for another day. We're going to watch 3 videos, kind of like last week. The only feedback I got, because I kept asking for feedback, the only feedback I got on the videos last week was from my mom. She said she liked them. So if you don't like them, it's your fault. You had the chance to chime in and you didn't. But these are videos that are going to explain the history a little bit better than I could. Not because I'm unaware of the history so much as I talk about stuff that only interests me sometimes and doesn't interest you. And this guy has a very concise way of stating things. Although he's not talking about things necessarily from a religious perspective, he's coming at it from the Jewish perspective, not the Christian perspective. So I want to mention a couple of things before we start the videos that kind of cover everything that happens. So remember, Pompey comes into Jerusalem, enters the temple. That's desecration, but he walks into the most holy place. He doesn't see anything in there, and that's the first historical record that we have that the ark is actually not there. Probably gone a long time before, but that's the first official mention in historical records that it wasn't there anymore. And slowly but surely, with Roman rule, more and more of Israel's territory kind of gets siphoned off. Remember during the Hasmonean dynasty, they had expanded what was kind of under Judean control, and now that's being chipped away again. And so Judea is going to be a much smaller province, really comprising Samaria, Judea, and Idumea by the time we get to the New Testament, and that's reflected in the Gospels. Galilee and the Decapolis is its own place. You have the places northeast of the Jordan River in Galilee. They're their own section, okay? Historically, all of this area was Israel in the Old Testament under David and Solomon, but again, Judea proper now is a much smaller enclave when you get to the New Testament. Julius Caesar has a lot to do with the story. Remember, he crosses the Rubicon, proclaims himself, ruler, king. Caesar, I think, is Latin, not Latin, but Caesar means king. And that starts down a trickle effect, okay, where Rome is no longer a republic ruled by the Senate, but ruled by a leader, an emperor, Caesar. And that's going to have ramifications in the New Testament, most obviously ramifications for the death and crucifixion of Jesus. But obviously, Caesar is assassinated et tu brute, and that starts a chain reaction as well. Palestine is not insulated from the changes that take place after Caesar's assassination. We find that Herod starts to shift his power around, Herod the Great, and exercise his rule, really beginning in 37 BC. This entire time, the Jews are becoming more and more discontent with, their political situation, but they feel helpless because, if you can't fight City Hall, what are you going to do about the Roman Empire, right? And so they more or less make their peace with the reality of everything. But at the same time, this leads to more and more hopeful expectation that the Messiah will actually arise and deliver them, because, Rome is just oppressive. Really, the taxes that Rome levies on Judea are pretty hefty. Now, Julius Caesar is actually very kind towards the Jews. He exempts them from military service. He allows them to observe the Sabbath and doesn't make them work. Okay. But while that's great for the Jews that are living outside anywhere other than Judea, the ones in Judea, that's nice for them too, but they got to pay a lot of taxes that the Jews in Judea, or the Jews in the diaspora, don't necessarily pay. So it's kind of nice to be a Jew, but not living in Judea under the Roman Empire, if that makes any sense. But Julius Caesar is the one that kind of gives a lot of those perks to the Jews. Herod's rise was backed by Rome and Mark Antony. He defeats Antigonus, who is the last Hasmonean ruler, and he begins to consolidate his power. He purges the old aristocracy, and he creates kind of a new class called Herodians. These are people of wealth and status socially, but the biggest point is they're people of wealth and status that support Herod. Okay, if you are a person of wealth and status and don't support Herod, you keep your big mouth shut, and you suddenly become apolitical, or you wind up mysteriously dead. All right. Herod is ruthless. Herod the Great is absolutely ruthless. And it's interesting what we know for him from history outside of the Bible and the way he's depicted in the Bible, completely simpatico. Okay. He's incredibly paranoid. He murdered a whole bunch of family members because he thought they were trying to usurp the throne. He's the one that he ordered that when he died, that a whole bunch of people be executed along with his death so that people would be sad when he died. That's not an exaggeration. That actually happened historically. Josephus tells us that. How demented do you have to be to say, you know what, when I kick the bucket, just execute a whole bunch of people, like hundreds of people, so that the populace will be sad that I'm gone? If you want people to cry at your funeral, then I guess that's one way to do it, but that's not out of the Dale Carnegie book, okay? But that's Herod the Great. He's responsible for starting to control things in Jerusalem. He has the high priest under his thumb, okay? The Pharisees hate him. The Pharisees actually kind of rule the Sanhedrin, but the high priesthood is ruled by Herod, and so you have some friction there. The Pharisees increasingly are developing schools in which they teach the populace the law and spirituality. You're going to see the great thought of Hillel come to significance during this period of Herod's reign. Hillel becomes kind of a political rival to Herod, and it is Hillel that has a particular view on marriage, divorce, and remarriage that is popular among the religious leaders of Jesus' day, but that Jesus takes some difference with. There were two schools of thought on marriage and on divorce and remarriage among the religious leaders, and they're basically coming to Jesus in Matthew 19 in parallel passages, wanting him to pick one or the other. And he doesn't really do that. But those different schools of thought among the Pharisees developed during the reign of Herod. And one of the kind of the heirs to one of those schools of thought is Gamaliel, who we meet in the book of Acts, who is a big leader among the Pharisees in Acts chapter 4 and other places. Herod, though, does get on the good side of some of the religious leaders, because while he's incredibly oppressive and a paranoid, maniac, he is responsible for massive building projects. He builds up the town of Caesarea, fortifications throughout Judea, but also he is responsible for drastically expanding what significant building or complex in Jerusalem? Does anybody know?
The temple.
The temple, very good. So, the Second Temple's been there since the late 6th century BC, but it just wasn't that big of a complex as it became under Herod. It was massively expanded, and it was gorgeous. And it still didn't rival the prestige of Solomon's temple, but it was pretty impressive, and Herod is responsible for that. Now, knowing his character, he's clearly trying to, win friends and influence people that way. But the reason, and it took several years to, do those renovations and expansion, but it was complete by the time of Jesus' ministry. And that's lingering in the background when in John 2, at the end of John 2, Jesus says, you can tear down this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And they're just all kinds of indignant because it's taken decades to bring this temple to what it is now. You're going to tear it down and build it back in 3 days? But John makes the note, he was talking about his body in the resurrection, not the physical temple. However, it is the claim that he will destroy the temple, full stop. It is the claim that Jesus said he would destroy the temple that is one of the charges that is brought against him at his trial. You see the connection now, all right, with Herod's temple. And that's what it was often called, Herod's temple, because it was so much larger and more expanded than the second temple that had been there since the late 6th century when they came back from exile. Herod dies in 4 BC, and that's when his kingdom is kind of divided up among 3 of his sons. You have Archelaus, who ruled over Judea, Samaria, Idumea. He was a very harsh ruler, and eventually he was replaced by Roman prefects or governors. Pontius Pilate will be one of those governors. Basically, Archelaus is just a bad dude. Okay. Then you have Herod Antipas. He is given rule over Galilee and Perea. He's active during the time of Jesus. He's the one that has John the Baptist executed. He's also the one that Jesus goes up against during his trial before his death. Herod punts the ball and delivers him back to Pontius Pilate for political reasons. The third son is Philip II. He's given reign over Iturea and Trachonitis. I don't know how to pronounce that word. That's in the northern tetrarch, if you will, kind of northeast of Galilee a little bit. Interestingly enough, Antipas, on a trip to Rome, is going to fall in love with Philip II, his brother's wife, named Herodias, and gets her to divorce Philip so that she can marry him. And it's her daughter that does a salacious, probably sexually explicit dance for him on his birthday. And he says, because he's so impressed with her, not his daughter, but it's his stepdaughter, I'll give you anything you want up to have my kingdom. And she says, I want whose head on a silver platter? John the Baptist. Okay. So that's lingering. And guess who had the audacity to tell him, you have no right to be married to her. She's your brother's wife. John the Baptist. Okay. So that's kind of the highlights of what we're going to see in the videos. Any comments or questions before we start those?
I think the temple wasn't done until like 62, 64.
Yeah, so it kind of depends on when do you say it's finished. Now, obviously, I'm not sure because, in fact, I was not allowed into the architectural meetings at the time. But I have a sneaky suspicion that this is just an ongoing project, but they didn't know it was an ongoing project. It's kind of like you buy a fixer-upper and you fix it up, and then a year or 2, 5, 10 years later, you're like, well, I want to fix it up a little bit more. And then later, I want to fix it up a little bit more. So my parents bought a fixer-upper, a real fixer-upper in Mississippi when we moved back there in 1995. My dad shot a home video of what it was like before we officially moved in. There are two things or three things that stand out to me. Mom, correct me if I'm wrong. One, the driveway was horribly rutted. There was a very long driveway that went down and then back up to the house from the road, and it was very rutted. One of the first things we did, or my parents did, was they brought in gravel and had it kind of, smoothed out and gravel put down so it was easier to get up and down the drive. Second thing I remember was there was an actual hole in the living room floor. The house had a crawl space and there was an open hole in the floor. Am I right about that? Okay, well, in my version of events, which is always correct because my family never questions my memory, I remember a hole in the floor of the living room. But the other thing that stood out, there's no way she can deny that. If she doesn't remember this, she's old and senile, and I'm going to put her in a home. The whole bath was Pepto-Bismol pink. Okay. It was actually, my memory is it was actually two houses that had been pushed together at some point, and then a third sunroom added onto the back. I think, does that sound right, maybe?
We've been added onto several times.
Okay, but I added onto several times, yeah.
Two old houses.
Yeah. Anyway, and my parents did a lot of fixing up to it. I mean, I know that, immediately we did some pretty big structural or some cosmetic changes. But over time, we did even more things. I think we had lived there 2 years before my dad actually painted the exterior, which was a kind of a brown or brown purplish color to a more of a barn red that looked a lot nicer. I think he did that in the summer of '97. I remember because that was my first year at scout camp. And then around January of '97, my pop came down. He and my dad actually built on to the sunroom after enclosing it, and built on kind of it was supposed to be a screened-in porch, but my pop overruled my mom and had his way, and it actually became a kind of like another sunroom. They basically replaced the outside deck. My point is, you think you're done with the fixer-upper until suddenly you're not. You want to change some things. So my point is, I think in the time of Jesus, it was considered complete until they decided, let's add on to it again. But there was a state of completion and accomplishment when Herod died. Now, I could be wrong on that, but that's my reading of the tea leaves, if that makes sense. Yeah. But you're right. It's only about 10 years before it's burned, slapped to the ground, that they kind of finished with it. And who's to say that if it had still stood after AD 70, they'd been like, we need new curtains or something. Okay. So, yeah. Very good. All right. Let's watch the videos.